exact words sliced through the reception, and the orchestra's brass faded into a nervous shimmer. I stood from our banished table at the back table, 15, with its smaller centerpiece and handwritten place cards, and walked not out, but to the shadowed perimeter, where the entire room became a quiet diagram of choices. 200 guests clustered under crystal and orchids, the towering cake catching light like a crown. Lily looped across the dance floor in silk and sparkles, Anderson's hand anchored at the small of her back, his eyes sweeping the room as though appraising inventory. Charles, my husband of 3 decades, and my partner through every winter and rebound the business world could conjure, sat alone twisting his ring, as if it were the dial that could tune this night to a kinder station. I pressed his shoulder on my way past and told him to wait in the car, though I had no intention of leaving until the truth took its first breath. The truth had not been born in Connecticut, but in Boston on a snow-soft night months earlier, when we opened our front door on Beacon Hill and welcomed Anderson into the museum of our family's beginnings. Parker Logistics began with a single van and a landline in 1990, and over 30 years it grew into offices spanning a dozen states, a network built on relationships, margins shaved to efficiency and systems I had drawn by hand, while Charles shook hands and pitched futures in rooms that smelled like power and leather. That night, we polished silver that had my grandmother's fingerprints nested deep in the pattern, and poured a bottle we had saved for a decade, a 1995 vintage, whose cork rose like history. To family, Charles said, and Lily beamed beside a man whose suit was perfect and whose smile seemed practiced by mirrors. He praised the Singapore expansion and our patience across recessions. He knew the right names and the right phrases, and when he moved through the living room, his gaze took the measure of photographs the way an appraiser measures quiet value. Daniel, our eldest with careful eyes, found me later by the sink and spoke softly. Something is off. He had seen Anderson once in Singapore under another name, a fact that felt like misremembered trivia until it returned with teeth. I did not want to be suspicious. Mothers make a habit of hope. Still, I watched Lily in the months that followed how her weekly lunches dissolved into excuses, and her phone lit her face with secret smiles, how Anderson says crept into her sentences like an infection. She called the company old-fashioned over Sunday dinner, picking at her food, while Charles explained why our slow, deliberate approach had weathered storms. She dismissed the past as dead and the present as sluggish, and when I set down the chocolate soufflé at 7:15 p.m., her fingers were still moving beneath the table, in a rhythm I knew was not prayer. The night our potential partners came to dine, Anderson arrived radiant with confidence and steered conversation the way a pilot finds tailwinds. With an easy laugh and a teacup's clink, he extracted timelines, shipping corridors, and margins that had taken us years to assemble. And though Daniel pivoted topics with grace, dessert had barely settled before our strategy had practically stood up and introduced itself. A week later, Daniel closed my office door at 9:40 a.m., his face drawn by hours without sleep, and slid a manila folder toward me. Inside lay a story told in documents, a Cayman shell called Westream Holdings, incorporated shortly after Lily's first date with Anderson. Bank transfers labeled as consulting fees sent to my daughter's account. Bid paperwork for our Asia project that echoed our own strategy too closely to be coincidence. He then placed system access logs upon my desk, better than fingerprints, and worse than gossip, showing Lily's credentials used after hours to pull contracts, pricing models, and the proprietary routing algorithm Charles had built on legal pads in 1997. I wanted a gentle explanation, but the next day, when I arrived at Lily's apartment, under the pretext of collecting childhood photos for a slideshow, the explanation greeted me in plain language on her laptop, a folder named Westream, packed with our documents edited to wear another company's clothes. When I asked what it was, her face hardened into the mirror of someone who had rehearsed contempt. She spoke of favoritism of houses given to her brothers in Cape Cod and Vermont, of a lifetime spent earning what boys were handed. I answered with the history she did not want summers her brothers spent driving roots and lifting crates, while she refused warehouse work as beneath her. The finance directorship she earned at 25, and the trust she could have leveraged into leadership if she had wanted the weight that follows real authority. This is the future, she said, meaning theft polished into innovation. I left with photographs on my phone and a tremor in my hands I would not allow into my voice. The family meeting that night arrived with the weather. Thunder stitched Boston's sky at 8:05 p.m., and rain rattled the windows, while I spread evidence across the dining table that had witnessed spelling tests and budget reviews and birthday candles. Charles's blood pressure medication rattled in his palm. Michael asked for mercy. Daniel demanded law, and I sketched the only plan I could live with: protect the company, gather clean proof, give my daughter one last door to choose. In the earliest blue of the wedding morning at 3:00 a.m., I unlocked the safe behind a painting of Cape Cod and pulled a red leather folder that smelled like ink and old ambition. Inside lay the bones of Parker Logistics in my handwriting, the first contracts, the first systems, the pattern that made growth repeatable. By 5:10 a.m., I was at the kitchen table with cold coffee and new reports from Daniel following the thread to its obvious end. By late morning, I had slid a drive across a cafe table to Mr. Jameson from the Securities Commission and asked him to attend as a witness, not a hammer. I promised no scene at the altar. I did not promise silence forever. At St. Thomas Church, sunlight filtered through stained glass onto pews filled with Boston's familiar names. Families whose donations gilded university halls, bankers whose handshakes carried the weight of mergers, socialites whose laughter floated through every gala. The ushers' fraternity brothers of Anderson guided Charles and me not to the front where the bride's parents belong, but to the 5th row behind cousins and acquaintances. A calculated demotion disguised as logistics. Charles stiffened, ready to protest, but I pressed his hand and whispered, "Not now." The ceremony itself was theater-vaulted arches, a string quartet, and Lily radiant in a gown with a train so long it took 2 bridesmaids to guide it down the aisle. Her smile gleamed for the cameras, yet never touched her eyes. Anderson recited vows with the cadence of a practiced salesman pausing perfectly for effect. His phone checked between hymns when he thought no one noticed. I remained silent when the priest invited objections, though several guests glanced my way, anticipation bright in their eyes. I would not spoil the ritual. Some truths ripen best when witnessed by the crowd that once applauded your downfall. The reception at Westfield Hall was a monument to excess. Ice sculptures, champagne cascades, and orchestra in tails. Yet Charles and I were seated at table 15, obscured behind a column with a collection of afterthought guests. The centerpiece was smaller, the chairs less padded, our place cards handwritten as if shame itself had arranged the details. Friends whispered falsehoods to one another, that we had fallen into financial trouble, that we had refused to gift Lily the beach house because we were bitter that Anderson had already engaged an architect to renovate what they believed was his prize. The rumor spread like perfume in summer air, cloying and impossible to dispel. Charles's face reddened, his hands clenched around a glass. "This is outrageous," he muttered. I laid my hand upon his and murmured, "Wait." Patience was the only weapon left to sharpen. Speeches began framed in dimmed lights and glasses raised. Anderson's best man toasted his relentless ambition, oblivious to the irony. The maid of honor champagne softened, gushed about Lily finally stepping from her family's shadow. Then Anderson himself took the stage, thanking Charles and me with a pause that confirmed every whisper of our supposed financial ruin. He announced a grand new international partnership, presenting his triumph as if Parker Logistics were an antique he had already pawned. Murmurs rippled through executives who knew our company well. their faces torn between curiosity and discomfort at such a declaration on a wedding night. Lily followed her tone, sugared with vengeance. Even those who couldn't give their daughter a wedding gift, she said, glass-raised eyes locked on me. Guests laughed awkwardly, complicit in humiliation. Anderson and I will build a legacy greater than anything Parker Logistics ever dreamed. Applause scattered like hail against windows sharp but uncertain. I stood then, my navy gown whispering with each step. To the crowd, it appeared I was leaving in disgrace, shoulders straight but heartbroken. They did not see me turn, not toward the exit, but toward the service corridor where staff managed details unseen. A folded bill slid across the DJ's table, a USB pressed into his palm, and a quiet agreement sealed with the knowledge that drama often pays in ways music never could. I watched the room from behind the curtain, waited until cake was served, until conversations softened into complacency. Then the DJ's voice rose. "Ladies and gentlemen, the mother of the bride has a few words." Spotlights converged, the orchestra hushed, and silence fell thick as velvet. 200 faces turned as I stepped forward, microphone in hand. Lily froze mid-bite of her cake. Anderson's polished smile cracked like porcelain dropped on marble. "You've heard her version," I began, voice steady, echoing to the farthest table. "Now let me tell you mine." The projection screen behind me flickered from childhood montages to evidence confidential documents lifted from Parker Server's bank transfers from Westream Holdings into Lily's account records beginning a week after her first date with Anderson. Gasps cut the room open. I explained in simple terms for those unfamiliar with corporate crimes, gesturing toward Mr. Jameson from the Securities Commission, seated discreetly at the side. Anderson shifted in panic eyes on the exit where our security blocked the way. The house Lily claimed as hers appeared next on the screen, the legal transfer already executed to my grandson Luke, to be held in trust until he turned 25. A legacy for loyalty, not entitlement. Lily's chair clattered backward as she surged to her feet, face streaked with tears and fury. "You're ruining my wedding!" she cried, lunging for the microphone. I stepped back, calm as stone. "Your wedding was ruined the moment it was built on theft," I said. "I didn't do this to you, Lily. You did this to yourself." The hall erupted into uneasy whispers, then open exits as investors and friends stood to leave, unwilling to be tied to scandal. Anderson attempted to slip away, but an old acquaintance, a shipping executive once courted by Westream, blocked him with a single cutting line. "Going somewhere, Reynolds, or whatever your name really is?" His empire of charm collapsed in minutes. Lily screamed, Anderson withered, and Charles met me at the edge of the stage, his embrace anchoring me as the crowd dissolved around us. By dawn, the scandal bloomed across Boston. Parker Logistics issued a statement stock prices rose 2 points in a single day, and Lily's name was stripped from company records. That afternoon, she called me voice broken. "You destroyed my life." Anderson left me. I answered evenly. He got what he wanted. Without our documents, there was no reason to stay. She begged, asking where she would live, how she would survive. "You're a Parker," I told her. "We don't raise victims. I'll give you enough for 6 months and a modest apartment. The rest, you must rebuild." Behind her sobs, I heard faintly the echo of a child once running to me with scraped knees, but the woman on the line was one who had chosen deception. Mercy could not erase consequence. The weeks that followed unfolded like chapters I had never wished to write. Anderson's name surfaced in whispers across boardrooms and conference calls. Daniel's investigation revealed a trail of identical cons companies, courted insiders, seduced confidential strategies stolen, and then silence when exposure drew near. Parker Logistics had simply been the largest jewel in his collection, the one he believed would cement his rise. Instead, his legacy became a cautionary tale. Our family, though shaken, found strange unity in defense. Michael balanced diplomacy with investors. Daniel pursued legal channels. Charles steadied the company with his quiet presence, and I, who had exposed my daughter before 200 witnesses, carried the strange weight of both executioner and mother. Lily's voice returned in calls that fluctuated between rage and despair. Some nights she spat blame, reminding me of promises she believed were hers by birthright. Other nights she whispered apologies wrapped in fear, asking where she should turn. When I reminded her that rebuilding required humility, she scoffed. When I refused to fold, she wept. At last, I transferred funds sufficient for 6 months of living expenses, an amount enough to survive yet too little to indulge. "You'll have to work," I told her gently. "Work and learn what trust really means." Her silence on the other end felt heavier than her words. The media storm circled for only days before Boston's social sphere turned its attention elsewhere. A charity scandal, a merger gone wrong. A senator's indiscretion. Society is merciless in both its fixation and its forgetfulness. Within Parker Logistics, however, the scandal left deep grooves. Employees walked taller, reassured that betrayal would not undo their labor. Investors expressed renewed confidence, admiring our decisiveness. The company that Charles and I had birthed in a garage felt strangely reborn, its spine stronger, its heart clearer. Yet at night, alone in the quiet of our Beacon Hill home, I still turned over photographs of Lily at 6, at 10, at 16. I wondered where exactly the hunger for more had crossed into the appetite for destruction. 6 months later, the Parker mansion swelled with laughter as Charles celebrated his 60th birthday. The dining room that once echoed with storms now rang with toasts and plans for expansion. Daniel and his husband spoke of opportunities in California. Michael and his wife revealed ultrasound images of their second child. And at the far end of the table sat Lily. Simpler now, stripped of jewels and grandeur, her hair pulled back in modest style, her robe exchanged for a plain dress. She had agreed to therapy to volunteer work to the patient conditions I required, before allowing her back into the circle of family. She did not seek to dominate the room. She listened, offered to help with dishes, even laughed at her brother's jokes without bitterness. Not forgiven entirely, not trusted fully, but present. That was the first step. Later that evening, as twilight settled across the garden and candles flickered against glass, Lily joined me among the roses. She twisted a silver band on her finger, the diamonds long gone. "Did you know he'd abandon me the moment you exposed him?" she asked, her voice softer than I had heard in years. I suspected, I admitted. "Men like Anderson don't love people. They love access. Once it's gone, they vanish." She nodded, eyes cast downward. "How did you know you were right and I was wrong?" she pressed. I studied her face, searching for the girl who once argued her allowance with charts at 9 years old. "When you've lived long enough," I answered, "you learn that power isn't in winning at any cost. It's in knowing when to fight, when to forgive, and when to let someone face the lessons they chose." Our conversation ended not with embrace, but with quiet understanding. Healing, like trust, is a process, not a decree. As we gathered for a photograph on the wide front steps, Charles, with silver hair glinting, Daniel steady beside his husband, Michael's son, tugging at his bow tie, Lily standing just slightly apart, the camera captured not perfection, but persistence. Luke, wide-eyed and earnest, tugged my sleeve. "Grandma, thank you for trusting me with the house," he whispered, "even though I can't live there now." I touched his cheek, seeing in him the future of everything Charles and I had built. "Sometimes the daughter you raise breaks your heart," I murmured softly enough for only him, yet Lily heard. "But the family you rebuild afterward can be even stronger." The shutter clicked, freezing the moment. In my heart, I carried not triumph, but peace, the quiet peace of a woman who had chosen truth over comfort, who had protected legacy even at the cost of love, who still believed in second chances when they are earned. And so I tell you this, guard, what matters even when it hurts, because loyalty and honesty are worth more than any house contract or fortune. If this story touched, you remember to like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments what family means to you. Your voice matters here as much as mine.